Hello, everybody. It's me, V, White Zulu, and welcome to another reading from my autobiography of the same name. I hope you're enjoying these chapters as I read them out from the entire book. And I promise I haven't left anything out. I've just gone straight through. And this one is a follow-on from the previous chapter. This is chapter 20. The previous one was chapter 19, the honey guide. This is chapter 20, the dragon's nest, and it follows on completely. If you recall, Evelina told us a pretty scary story about the honey guide. And it's not just her, I've heard it from many Zulus around the countryside, and particularly in the bush when I was a game ranger in the Umfolozi Llwyd Game Reserve. This greater honey guide and the lesser honey guides had the same reputation. Through the big sash window of my bedroom, I could see pearl-coloured sky above the gum trees, and the cicadas had already started their shrill scree, which would escalate to background static as the day got hotter and hotter. A rooster crowed from the huts behind our sheds, where the farm staff kept their rangy fowls, a few hens with little clusters of fluffy chicks scuffling around their feet, and the proud father strutting around on his tough-looking legs, his tail plumes iridescent green to contrast with his shining deep golden body and quivering scarlet comb. They scratched around the dusty bare earth surrounding the huts and ate pot scrapings, crusty, slightly blackened uputu left at the bottom of the three-legged cast iron pots after the families had eaten. I hopped out of bed and pulled on a pair of shorts and a t-shirt. Then I ran down the passage and out of the door leading onto the back veranda. Fitting my bare heel into the gouge where Grandpa had blown a chunk out of the wooden step with his shotgun when he'd shot the puff adder. I nearly collided with Evelina, who was sweeping the veranda with the soft broom, her back to me. "How? Where are you going in such a hurry? You should still be asleep in bed." I dodged around her bulk and called airily over my shoulder as I scampered across the lawn and towards the back gate. "I'm going to see Bongo and Jabu. There's something I want to ask them." "We'll be back soon then, or Nkosikazi will be cross. Come back when you hear the farm bell ring for breakfast." I skipped through the narrow wire gateway and ran down the road past the sheds, my bare feet padding along, kicking up puffs of red dust. Robert and Geeti, our nduna, was filling the Jeep's tank with petrol from a 44-gallon drum, and he raised his tattered khaki cotton hat to me in greeting. "Uyaphi, Nkosazana? Where are you going so fast, Chief's daughter? Is your house on fire?" And he guffawed at his joke, showing the few remaining teeth planted in his pink gums like crooked gravestones. I waved back and turned right to run up the sandy path which led to the compound where our Zulu staff lived. Cockatier was standing in front of her hut, stirring steaming uputu with a wooden spoon. She was tall and slender and had to stoop over the big black pot underneath which a fire crackled. Branches of burning gum were stuck in through the pot legs, and the fragrant eucalyptus-scented smoke mingled with steam from the stiff maize porridge, sending up a delicious aroma, which made my mouth water. "Sawubona, Nkosazana," she said, little surprised to find me there so early. "Would you like some breakfast? The putu is almost ready. Jabu, Bongi, come and eat your breakfast." They appeared from the dark interior of their hut and whooped with delight to see me. Jabu was 8 and wore a pair of ragged khaki shorts held up with string and a tattered t-shirt. His younger sister was 6, a year younger than me, and she was dressed in a faded cotton shift, which might once have been pink. We danced around excitedly while Lokatia took 3 enamel bowls from a rush mat near the pot and placed a steaming heap of uputu into each one. She poured a generous helping of amasi, curdled sour milk, over the porridge and sprinkled a big spoonful of dark brown government sugar on top. She gave us each a spoon and we sat down on a grass mat with our backs against the mud wall of their hut to eat. It was my favorite breakfast. It still is. The stiff, crumbly, yellow mealie meal porridge soaked up the tart, curdled milk, and the sugar gave the dish a sweet crunchiness. We gobbled our putu, scraping our bowls clean, and handed them back to Lokatia. I thanked her politely, and after declining her offer of strong coffee in an enamel mug, Jabu, Bongi and I skipped off down the path back to where it joined the road. We stopped. "What are we going to do today?" asked Jabu. "Listen," I whispered. "You know Nkwazi? Evelina was telling me about him yesterday." They both nodded warily. "Well, there's a pair living in that big yellowwood tree in the bush. They have a nest in the very top. I've seen them flying in to land there, and I've heard them screaming. There are young ones too. They yelp and call when they see their parents arriving. My father says there are lots of bones and skulls lying on the ground at the bottom of the tree. They must be children's skulls. Do we dare go up there and look?" We looked at each other apprehensively. Ungu and Jabu's eyes widened in alarm. They looked back at their huts, then down at their bare feet, which they shuffled nervously in the dust for a little while. "Do you know the way?" asked Bongi. "Is there a path?" "I think so," I said. "Come on, let's go a little way along the path, and if Nkwazi screams at us, we'll run away and hide." I sounded braver than I felt, but my reputation as ringleader was at stake, and I needed to show them who was in charge. We scurried down past the sheds and, pausing only to pick up a sturdy stick from under the huge gum trees which towered over us, we ran down to the district road and crossed it to climb through a barbed wire fence which surrounded the paddock next to the river. Keeping a sharp eye out for snakes, I swished and banged the stick from side to side in the long grass in front of me as we walked down to the river bank. That's in the picture behind me. That long bit of grass that you see is the walk down the paddock to the bush and the river. Dropping the stick, we squatted on our haunches and slipped down a wet, recently used otter slide into the cool water. It was tempting to get sidetracked and spend some time splashing each other in the river, but I was determined to get a good look at the tree with its nest. Far too frightened to go on my own, and this was a good opportunity with two co-conspirators as backup. Paddled across briskly before the crabs could scuttle from their dens to pinch our toes, and entered the dense dark green forest on the far bank of the river. It was the exact spot from which Ngeti had been calling yesterday. He was the honey guide. And this must be his favourite tree, which Evelina had described. I stood and looked up into the leafy branches, but could see nothing. I'd have to find and follow him some other day. We left the river behind us, with its electric blue dragonflies dancing over their sparkling reflections among the reeds on the banks. The bright orange wild Mombretia leaned, nodding over the ripples and eddies in rock pools. Pale blue wild agapanthus clustered next to creamy white arum lilies, and red hot pokers stood tall among fine lacy green maidenhair ferns. Narrow path rises sharply up the steep forest-covered hillside. The bush, more of a jungle, consists of masses of different evergreen indigenous trees growing closely together. There's thick undergrowth to push through, and vines and lianas hang from branches, twisting around tree trunks and even around each other, forming great ropes which dangled in loops across the track. Bushbuck had carved the path with their sharp hooves as they come down to the river twice a day, every day, to drink, and we could see their spoor on the slick, muddy ground. The bush stays wet even during the winter dry season, and as a result remains untouched by the bushfires which rage through gum, wattle and pine plantations everywhere in the Natal Midlands every year. We slipped and slid in our bare feet, pulling ourselves up the steepest slopes by vine ropes which hung conveniently within reach. An action that was not without its own risks, as big, red and very fierce biting ants use the ropes as their highways, carrying food to their nests, which hang in sinister black clumps in the forks of trees high up above. There isn't nearly as much colour as on the riverbanks, just grey-green, lime-green, apple-green, grass-green, dark green, and emerald-green shiny leaves everywhere. There was a creeper festooned over low bushes like Christmas decorations, growing prolifically with white small, sweet-scented, star-shaped flowers, like little pearls, which gleamed against its jade leaves. Moss of all shapes of green carpets the forest floor and covers every log and boulder, and long strands of greenish-grey lichen we call old man's beard hang dangling from the branches of all but the smallest trees. In the occasional clearing, big purple and blue butterflies with bright scarlet eyes on their wings rest in patches of the dappled sunlight, opening and closing their wings, so they looked as though they were appearing from nowhere by magic, and then disappeared as they closed their wings again, revealing the dark blue underside. We climbed higher and higher up the steep, thickly forested mountainside, pausing now and again to catch our breath. We were trying to walk silently, placing our feet carefully so as not to make any noise by snapping twigs. We breathed as quietly as our panting would allow. It was quite still apart from the odd bird call. A Natal robin made its squeaky, seesaw-like repetitive call, and cinnamon doves purred softly deep in the lush undergrowth. We were startled once or twice by the cock, cock, cock alarm call of the Neisner lory as it flew from a branch just above our heads, the scarlet beneath its wings flashing at us as it glided from another tree to perch and cackle at us indignantly. He raised his lime green crest with its white edge and cocked his head to one side to inspect us. We could hear a troop of Samango monkeys chattering further along the valley, unaware that we were nearby. They were foraging in the tree tops for insects. It was unusual to come across them here because, unlike vervet monkeys who prefer the bush, Samangos spend most of their time in our wattle plantations, feasting on resin, which they extract by tearing off strips of bark with their sharp canine teeth. We're nearly there. I stopped to wait for Jabu and Bongi to catch up and to listen for any other sounds. We sat on a mossy boulder to rest and catch our breath. Shh, the tree's up there. I pointed up the slope to where a massive trunk rose out of the surrounding undergrowth. Come on. Crouching and bent double, we crept closer. Bushes and brushwood gave way to thick, soft moss at the base of the towering tree. There was a lot of debris in the form of dry sticks and clumps of dead moss lying around, bits which had fallen from the nest over the years. Whitish objects lay among them. I stopped. Jabu and Bongi bumped into me from behind. We squatted there, unsure now. I looked back at them. They stared at me, the whites of their eyes bright in the gloom of the dark forest. They were waiting for me to make the next move. Holding my breath, I crawled forward slowly and reached out to touch the round off-white object lying on the moss. I picked it up. It was light, hard, and cold. With it in my hand, I scrambled backwards on my bum into the undergrowth where my friends were hiding. I looked closely at the thing in my hand. It was a skull. With a shriek of terror, I dropped it hurriedly, and wiping my hand frantically on my shorts, I backed away from it, my heart thudding furiously in my throat. Jabu and Bongi had run a little way back down the path and were now cowering behind a mossy boulder. After crouching on the ground for a few minutes to catch my breath and waiting for the churning in my stomach to subside, I crept forward and looked at the skull again. It was small, about half the size of my own head, and still had the jaw attached. It was lying on its side now, with the two gaping eye sockets staring at me. I shuddered. I sat and gazed at it while I thought about what I was going to do with this unexpected find. I wanted to take it home to show Dad, but I didn't want to touch it again. I looked back to the moss at the base of the yellow tree. About half a dozen sized skulls lay there, and lots of curved, long objects the same color, which, now that I looked at them more carefully, had to be ribs and leg bones from the same creature whose skull I'd picked up. There were other skulls too, smaller, flatter, and more as if they'd come from a very small dog, as well as a scattering of smaller bones of all shapes. And I had a brainwave and stood up and took my shorts off. There was no sign of Bongi and Jabu, but I knew they were still hiding behind their rock. I took my brooks off and pulled my shorts quickly back on. After that, I broke a twig off the nearest bush and used it to roll the skull carefully into my brooks, which I held open like a bag. I picked them up with the skull inside and held the leg and waist holes in my fist. Now I could carry the skull home without actually touching it. Wazanibo, come on, I called, and they crept out cautiously from their hiding place, their eyes fastened on the makeshift bag I was holding. Leave it there, pleaded Bongi. We don't want to take it away. What if Nkwazi follows us and wants it back? There's no meat left on it. That's why I threw it away, I said airily. I actually had no idea what Nkwazi would do. But bravado is my middle name, and I sauntered nonchalantly off down the mountainside with my Brooks bag and my companions carefully treading a safe distance behind me. By the time we reached their hut, I knew that there was some sort of uproar going on. I could hear Evelina calling for me, her voice echoing through the valley and bouncing back at us. Lokatia hurried anxiously out of her doorway as soon as she saw us. You must run home quickly, Nkosazana. Evelina's been calling for you all morning. Look, I said, and held out my brooks, letting them fall open to reveal the skull. Aye, she screamed and ran back into her hut. Throw it away. It's some dagati. She wailed from the dark interior where she was cowering. Wrapped it and saying goodbye to Bongi and Jabu, who had run into their home the minute their mother screamed and were hiding behind her. I padded along the road past the sheds towards the house and Evelina's voice. She was standing at the back gate, her hand up to shield her eyes from the midday sun. "Oh," she shouted when she saw me coming up the road. "Where have you been? I told you to be back for breakfast, and it's nearly lunchtime. Nkosikazi will be very cross with me if she finds out that you missed breakfast. What have you been doing?" she scolded as I approached. "Look," I said, and held out my parcel again, revealing the skull. The effect on Evelina was even more dramatic than on Locatia. She jumped backwards with her eyes popping out of her head like a cartoon character. If she'd had a hat on instead of her white duck, it would have flown off her head. "Aibo!" she screamed, and turned and ran towards the kitchen as fast as her plump legs could carry her. Masangu and Makai came out of the kitchen doorway to see what the screaming was about. "Mdagati," she said. "Nkosazana has brought him Mdagati." They stopped in their tracks. Excuse me. And instead of going back into the kitchen, the two men bolted towards the janine, the thatched hut, which served as a laundry. As they darted inside, Evelina barreled past them and thundered into the hut, her bare feet pounding on the wooden floor. They slammed the door shut, and Evelina appeared at the small window to shout, "Susa lento! Take that thing away," just before she shut the window with a bang and started to wail. I stood there on the back lawn holding the skull, astonished at this reaction. I knew I could get a satisfactory result from the servants and farm labourers by sidling up to them with my hand behind my back and suddenly whip out a live chameleon. They'd scream and jump and run away, but only far enough to shout at me to put it back in the bush. But this behaviour was unprecedented. I'd only ever once sprung a chameleon on Masangu, because after he'd recovered from his fright, he picked up a carving knife and chased me out of the kitchen with a terrible bellow, leaving me feeling quite alarmed. Now he was cowering in the janine, as terrified as the others were. I walked into the kitchen and through the house to the front veranda, where Mum and Dad were sitting, drinking their pre-lunch gins. I held out the skull to Dad. "Look what I found," I said. He took it carefully and turned it over in his hands, inspecting it with great interest. "It's a monkey skull, a vervet, and quite a big one, judging from the size. Where did you find it?" "Under that big yellowwood tree in the bush, the one with Nkwazi's nest at the top." "That's not Nkwazi's nest," he said. "That's the crowned eagle's nest. They eat monkeys, dassies, and even blue duikers." "So it's only a monkey skull." I was a little bit disappointed. "Why did the servants take off screaming like that when they saw it then?" They probably thought it was a child's skull. They believe that Nkwazi, the fish eagle, snatches small children and carries them off to feed their young. Dad was on his second pink gin and was feeling expansive. But Nkwazi nests in those willow trees up in the flays where the best fishing is, not down here in the bush. They were shouting Mdagati as they ran away, I explained. Ah, that means they definitely thought it was the skull of a child, one who was killed for Moti, a spell. There's some bad witchcraft that goes on around these parts, and now and again an innocent Zulu child gets murdered, and parts of him or her are chopped up for Moti against an enemy. Other parts get buried in certain places. They're a bunch of bloody savages, really, he said, and took a sip from his glass. Lots of other bones under the nest, I said. Would those be duiker bones? Probably. I'll tell you what, when I've had my afternoon snooze, we'll walk up there and take a proper look at the ground under the nest. I was planning to go into the bush anyway to look for snares. Those bastards can't resist putting snares in or hunting with their Kaffir dogs, no matter how much free meat they're given. Oh, yes, please, I said. I'd love to look at all those bones, and skipped off for my lunch, only to find the kitchen deserted. Mum called me back. Don't forget your brooks. You'd better give them to Leeshaw to wash. Gin had mellowed her too. And you'd better tell the servants that's only a monkey skull, or we won't get any lunch, added Dad dryly. I walked down the kitchen steps and over to the Janine. It's only the skull of Mgao, the vervet monkey, I called, through the closed door. The Zulu name Mgao is onomatopoeic and is exactly how vervets sound when they give their alarm call, Mgao. There was silence, and then the door opened a crack. An anxious brown face appeared. Are you sure? Asked Masangu. Yes, Nkosazana said. It's Ngao's skull. The door creaked open slowly, and the 3 house servants came out cautiously, still not quite sure whether this was another of my tricks. Where is it? I left it on the veranda with Nkosazana, I said. Can I have my lunch now? With a lot of dark muttering, our chef stomped crossly up the steps into the kitchen to dish up lukewarm mince and mash for me and Delia. And Mackay replaced his fez, which had fallen to the ground in his panic, and went back to laying the dining room table for my parents. Evelina went off to call Leeshaw, who was looking after Delia somewhere down by the tennis court. At 4, Dad picked up his walking stick, whistled for the dogs, and we walked down the paddock, same one, across the river and into the cool, dark green bush, retracing the steps I'd taken that morning with Bongi and Jabu. We followed the bushback path, Dad stopping every now and again to check the undergrowth on either side, looking for signs to indicate that a snare had been set. There's one, he said, and poked a cunningly hidden circle of baling wire with the tip of his stick. Duck steps into the middle of that and look. As he touched the inside of the noose, It shot suddenly upwards, attached to a strong, springy sapling which had the long strand of wire tied to it. That's strong enough to tighten around his leg or even his neck. He'd be tracked there until they come and check the snares in a few days' time. It's a horrible, slow way for an animal to die. And he shook his head grimly. Barbarians. I pulled the noose off the sapling and looked at it closely. It was so neatly done that the thin wire looked exactly like the coiled, dry end of a vine, of which there were plenty throughout the forest. Hang it on the branch over there. He pointed to a knobthorn tree growing at the edge of the path. As high as you can reach. Then they'll know I've found it. I'll put the word out tomorrow morning, warning the whole of them that I'm finding snares in the bush again, and I'll shoot any Kaffir dog I find on this farm. I don't want them hunting in the bush, damn it. I climbed up to the big yellowwood tree, Dad making sure the dogs were well to heel in case they got caught in a snare too. Here, I called, pointing to the moss at the base of the massive trunk. Dad walked around the tree and picked up one of the dog-shaped skulls. This is a blue duiker skull. Look, it can't be bigger than a fox terrier. It's amazing to think that there's an antelope that small. Easy for a crowned eagle to grab, though. They're very powerful birds. They have to be able to pluck a fully grown vervet off a branch, and my God, those monkeys can hang on tight. They also have extra broad wings to be able to maneuver between the densely growing trees with such a heavy cargo. He poked another small and strangely shaped skull lying on the moss. That's a dassie skull. They're another favorite food that the eagles have to share with leopards. Did you know dassie's closest relatives are elephants? Even though they look like big rabbits. I'll show you in the mammal book when we get home. These other bones must be legs and ribs that they've chucked out of their nest. There's been a pair of eagles raising a chick every 2 years in that nest as long as I can remember. Even as a small boy, I could hear their pee-wit call all summer long. I collected up as many skulls as I could carry, and we made our careful way back down the mountainside, across the river and home. As I trotted along behind Dad, I was busy making plans to tackle Evelina as soon as possible on this whole Umtagati story. That's all for this time. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope I'm also being able to teach you a little bit about indigenous bush wildlife and everything that goes on in there. It's all terribly exciting. I want to thank John Moslane very much for enabling me to do these videos, acting as my sound engineer, as I call him, for want of a better description. Without him, I couldn't do these videos. And I want to thank you all for listening to my stories. If you want to find more information, go to my website, www.whitezulubook.com, and you'll find plenty more information and photographs there. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you soon. Goodbye.